lot of information out there on immigration. I could easily do a 6-week sermon series on this topic. But I've decided instead of that, I'm just going to do 1 3-hour sermon a day. So settle in. No, I wouldn't do that. But anyway, there's a lot more than could be said than I will be said. Anyhow, Leviticus 19, 33 and 34. When a foreigner resides among you in your land, do not mistreat them. The foreigner residing among you must be treated as your native born. Love them as yourself, for you were foreigners in Egypt. I am the Lord your God. Very short and simple passage from Leviticus. You know, we have often heard it said that we are a nation of immigrants, and of course that is true. But what you do not hear said very often, and perhaps not even realized by people of Judeo-Christian heritage, is that we are also a faith of immigrants. In fact, immigrations of people played major roles in the Old Testament and in the development of the Jewish Christian faith. The 2 biggest events that happened in the Old Testament all had to do with people having to move from one place to another. The biggest, of course, was when the Israelites were living in Egypt. And if you remember the story, the Egyptians got nervous because the Israelites were increasing in number. And so the Egyptians decided to enslave the Israelites. And that is where the Israelites became the first immigrants, not wanted in their town or in their area, unless turned into slaves. And that, of course, ultimately led to them leaving Egypt, leaving behind misery, to go to a land of promise and hope, as they immigrated once again, looking for a better life. Out of that story, we get Moses, we get the 10 Commandments, we get Passover. Major figures, major celebrations and events coming out of that story, where the people of Israel had to leave and go to another place. The second most significant event in the Old Testament is the Babylonian exile, when the people were taken by force into forced immigration into Babylon. And while they were there, they had to change the way they approached their faith. Because they were now in Babylon, they did not have access to the temple, and their religion, which had once been centered around the temple, with the priest having high position, had to be replaced with a religion that focused on a text. And the scribes became more important. In fact, much of what we think of as our Old Testament came to be because the Israelites were in Babylon against their will. Out of the Babylonian exile came prophets. Out of the Babylonian exile came the ability for biblical scholars today to date the events of the Old Testament. We can tell by reading different documents whether something happened before the exile or after the exile. Very important event. Another event where people were uprooted from their homes and had to go to another place. Ultimately, they were released to go back home. Very important, very powerful stories found in our Old Testament. In the Old Testament, God instructs Israel 36 times. 36 times to make sure that they take care of the foreigner, the widow, and the orphan. Because they were the most vulnerable people in the culture. So pretty important stuff. And the logic that God uses with the people is what's said in this passage. When a foreigner resides among you in your land, do not mistreat them. The foreigner residing among you must be treated as your native born. Love them as yourself, for you were foreigners in Egypt. I am the Lord your God. But there are a lot of words that are used in Scripture that kind of mean immigrant or a substitute for immigrant. Those words include foreigner, alien, sojourner, wayfarer, and stranger. All of those words kind of cluster together to mean kind of the same thing as immigrant. They are characterized by being totally vulnerable and dependent upon their hosts. And it is out of that they're developed in the cultures of that time what is known as the hospitality code, which is how you welcome strangers, foreigners, aliens, sojourners. These were the rules, the cultural rules that you followed. So that if they came to you and you were their host, you were obligated to provide them with food, clothing, and shelter. You were obligated to share what you had with them. And if you breached that code, it was a major offense bordering on a crime. We have examples of this in the Old Testament, stories that you know. Remember when Abraham entertained the 3 strangers beneath the oaks of Mamre. They came, he saw them in the distance, he got up, he rushed about, had a feast prepared for them, took care of them, extended hospitality to these travelers, these strangers, these wayfarers. And then a few chapters later in Sodom, remember Sodom? And these strangers that were with Abraham have now gone into Sodom, and they are at the house of Lot. And Lot practices hospitality, invites them in, offers them food, clothing, and shelter, meaning protection, because the rest of the citizens of Sodom were not showing hospitality and wished to harm the strangers, the foreigners, the aliens. But Lot showed hospitality, and Lot was one of the few people who escaped. So it's all throughout the Old Testament. It's a very powerful part of the Bible, how we treat the vulnerable. Those who are less vulnerable are expected to take care of those who are more vulnerable. That's just the way it is in Scripture. You remember in Matthew, the passage about where Jesus talks about the king who will separate the sheep from the goats, and there will be a judgment. And one of the lines is when the king says to the sheep, I was a stranger, I was a foreigner, alien, sojourner. I was a stranger and you welcomed me. Come into the glory of the kingdom. And then he said to the goats, I was a stranger, alien, foreigner, and you did not welcome me. That's found in Matthew chapter 25. And the other thing that we have to pay attention to is that, of course, the Bible was written long before the United States of America was even thought of. But it wouldn't even matter, because the Bible does not care about legal status. The Bible doesn't care about the law. Do you remember the time the lawyer asked Jesus, what is the most important law? What's a law more important than the 10 Commandments? More important than all of the other laws that were given to us by God? Do you remember what Jesus said? Jesus said, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and you shall love your as yourself. If there is a law more important than anything written in our Constitution, anything written on any of our criminal code books, it is. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. And you remember what the lawyer asked? Well, who's my neighbor? In other words, who am I responsible for? Who am I supposed to love? That sounds an awful lot like modern day people saying, okay, well, who's legal and who isn't? Who do I owe something to and who do I not? And you remember Jesus' response? Jesus responded by telling the story of the good Samaritan. Somebody who was not proper. Somebody who was impure, ethnically, religiously. Someone hated by the Jewish people. And in the story of the Good Samaritan, remember the Samaritan, he's traveling, and he comes across a stranger, and he helps, for us to remember when we think about something like immigration, as we think about where our Christianity has to take priority over our Americanism. And it's very important that we think about this. Now, I've spent a lot of time this last week looking at immigration. And I got to tell you, I was swamped. The information out there, I mean, it can take weeks to sift through it all, to find out what is legitimate and what isn't, because everybody, you go to the websites and they claim we're objective, and then you learn that they're not objective. So it's taken me a lot of time to go through this. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about some of the sources that I've used to give you some of the information that I have today. I want to tell you that most of the information that I'm giving you today came from the national group known as the United Methodist Women. Do we have any United Methodist Women in here? The United Methodist Women put out absolutely fantastic material per study on a range of topics. So I am using much of what I have here comes from the United Methodist Women study on immigration. Very important that you know that. It's also important that you know that in addition to the United Methodist Women, I got much of my information from the United States Chamber of Commerce. The United States Chamber of Commerce has also been helpful. I also found articles in Forbes magazine, a reference to the Conservative America's Majority Foundation and the Cato Institute. So I want to tell you up front, those are kinds of places where I'm getting the data that I will be sharing with you. First of all, I came across reasons for immigration, and there's a nice little chart called the push and the pull of immigration.
That's Methodist.
Oh,
back up.
Sorry.
The push and the pull of immigration. The push is what makes people want to leave where they are, and the pull is what makes people want to come to a certain place. So the push, why are people wanting to immigrate to the United States? Not enough jobs, low wages, persecution, famine or drought, desertification, having to do with climate change, slavery, human trafficking, poor medical care, war, and then the list could just go on and on and on and on and on. Some of the reasons that they're wanting to leave, regardless of what you think about it, have to do directly with United States foreign policy. You remember NAFTA? Now, NAFTA, I believe that was a Bill Clinton idea, wasn't it? Remember correctly? NAFTA has had a disastrous impact on the poor Mexican farmers. They now have grain imported from the United States at very cheap prices. They've basically been run out of business, and so that's one of the reasons so many of them are looking for a better life. Just like within our country, family farms have been hurt by large agribusinesses, and how many of those people are migrating to cities looking for other work. So that's part of the problem. Also, we have a history in Latin America and South America of opposing democratically elected officials, supporting dictatorships. We don't have a great history, so when they come to us and they get to our fence, a lot of work has already been done. And so it's important that we know that. That's the push. And the pull, of course, is jobs, higher wages, freedom, better life, education, labor standards, better medical care, security. I mean, good Lord. How many times have we said this is the best country on earth, right? Why wouldn't people want to come? The push and the pull. This is where the meat of the immigration issue lies, and it is hardly ever discussed on television. We like to focus on fence. This is the heart of the matter, and it's more difficult than the fence. So push and pull is important to remember. I've also discovered some myths about immigration that I wanted to share with you. And in a minute, I'll play that video that has a few more myths about it. And again, I told you the places where I got the information. First of all, the myth that immigrants, documented or undocumented, are coming to take away jobs from Americans. The video is going to address that, but I just wanted to point out one thing that's obvious, and I couldn't believe I hadn't thought of this before. How many of you know the baby boomers? Baby boomers. Baby boom generation? Largest generation up to that point in history, correct? 77 million of them are going to be leaving the workforce in the next few years. 77 million workers. I don't think immigrants are going to be taking our jobs. 77 million are leaving the workforce. Another myth is that undocumented workers don't pay taxes, and that is absolutely dead wrong. Not only do they pay sales tax and property taxes, more than half pay Social Security and Medicare taxes, and they do not qualify to receive benefits from either of those places, and yet they pay into them. In Oregon alone, undocumented workers pay between $136 and $187 million in taxes each year. Another myth is that today's immigrants are not assimilating into society, that they're different from immigrants done in the past, and that's also not true. They are assimilating at a slightly faster rate than did the Italian, Polish, and Eastern European immigrants that immigrated in the 1900s. Here's how it works. It's called the rule of three generations. The first generation comes into this country and they don't speak the language. They have children. The second generation is bilingual. They have children. The third generation cannot talk to the grandparents. And that's the way it happens with all the other waves of immigrants, and that's the way it's happening today. It also has been shown that about 40% of first-generation immigrants learn to speak English within the first 2 years that they're here. 75% learn to speak English within the first 10 years that they come. So it does matter to them. So that's something you also need to know. It's also a myth that there are far more immigrants today than ever before, that we're just being overwhelmed and overrun. Today, the immigrant population of the United States, both undocumented and documented, constitutes 12% of our population. 12%. Throughout the last century, the number has moved between 10 and 15%. Between 10 and 15% is the norm, going all the way back to the early 1900s. Today, it's at 12%. So it's right in keeping with where it's always been. They are less likely to be imprisoned than native-born Americans. The Conservative America's Majority Foundation found that states with the highest immigration rates also had the lowest rates of crime in general and violent crimes in particular. And there's also absolutely no evidence that there's ever been any connection between illegal immigration and terrorism. Now I'm going to show you the video.
The next method
Came across was, I've thought this myself. This has been a very dramatic week in my own thinking. The question is, well, why not just do it legally? I hear that a lot. That's not nearly as simple as you may believe. I have some slides, and I don't expect you to be able to read all the small print, but I'll tell you, I have it in front of me. For the majority of the 11 million undocumented immigrants in the United States, there is no line. For the majority of potential immigrants, this possibility of receiving legal status to live in the United States is impractical or simply not attainable. Now remember the reasons that people leave. The push column there, they leave for all those reasons. They want to come for all the good things about us. Remember that. For most of them, there is no line, there's no door they can take legally. There are 4 doors that people can use. The first one is called, I have family members who are United States citizens. Go ahead and go to the next slide. If you fall into this category, let me get my glasses out here. If you are the parent, spouse, or minor child of a United States citizen, your family member may petition for a green card for you. This is the easiest way to become a citizen. No annual limit on the number of spouses, minor children, and parents of U.S. citizens who can receive documentation. Immigrant spouses with a green card are eligible for citizenship in 3 years. If you are a parent of a U.S. citizen, your green card can transition to citizenship in 5 years. To become a naturalized citizen, processing takes 6 to 12 months, and then you have to pass the language and civics test. For a total time for an immigrant to become a citizen, if everything goes well, it's 5 to 7 years. So it takes a number of years if you qualify through this door. Most of them do not. All right, I'm going to go on to, I have family members who are lawful residents, so that'll be 2 slides away. I don't want to be redundant. I have family members who are lawful permanent residents. If you are the spouse or minor child of a lawful permanent resident, your relative may petition for a green card on your behalf. The wait time depends on where you are from. So one thing I learned is that there are a lot of nations who are given quotas or allotments that they can send people over. There's such a thing known as the green card lottery. And it's this diversity lottery. We try to bring in people from countries that don't send as many immigrants. For all the other countries in the world, there's a cap on the number of people that can come in. And if you look at the backlog right now, the backlog for many of the countries where people want to come from the most, there are hundreds of thousands of people in line ahead of them. So it's important to know that. With a green card, if you have a family member who's a permanent resident, you can apply for citizenship in 5 years. Total time to be a citizen is 10 to 13 years. If you're a single child adult of a lawful permanent resident, you have to wait 9 to 14 years for a green card. Total time to immigrate and become a citizen is 9 to 25 years. Now, suppose you have a genius IQ, or have great athletic abilities, or investment capital. Get in line. You can probably get your green card within 12 to 18 months. After you get your green card, it can take 5 to 6 years before you can become a citizen. Total time to immigrate is about 6 to 7 years. If you have a degree in a specialized area and a job offer, you can, before you get a green card, you will need a temporary work visa to start your new job. Get in line. You might be wasting your time, though, but only about 85,000 temporary work visas issued each year. They are snatched up on the very first day available. If you are one of the few to get a temporary work visa, you can start your employment. If I have a degree in a specialized area and a job offer, if your employer is willing to file paperwork on your behalf, conduct a domestic job search for the position and pay thousands of dollars in legal fees, get in line. You may have to wait 6 to 10 years for a green card. After you get your green card, you can then become a citizen in 5 or 6 years. After about 11 to 16 years, in all, you can become a U.S. citizen. So congratulations, if one of those doors works for you, you're in for a long wait. Now, what if I don't have family in the U.S. or specialized skills? And now we're talking about the vast majority of people who are coming for all those reasons listed on the push side of the column. The vast majority. Sorry, there is no line for you. If you aren't highly skilled and don't have relatives who are United States citizens or lawful permanent residents, the likelihood of receiving a green card is minuscule. The wait time for unskilled immigrants with no relatives living in the U.S. can be decades, depending on which country you are from. And immigrants receiving worker visas for seasonal work cannot transition to a green card. So there isn't a way. Now, this is something that caught my eye. You may still have a door. There are some humanitarian options for very vulnerable people, such as immigrant women who are the victims of domestic abuse, immigrant children who are unaccompanied by their parents or other adult caregivers, refugees and asylum seekers who are fleeing persecution in their homelands on account of either their race, religion, political opinions, or membership in a particular social group. But it is very complicated. For instance, if you are an immigrant who has fled persecution and are seeking asylum, you cannot apply for asylum outside the United States. And you can't be in the United States unless you qualify to stand in one of the few lines that we've already discussed. So there is no line for you there either. When people are fleeing the conditions that they are living in, I think it is reasonable to expect that multi-year delays are not going to be something they can foresee. So, I've been giving you a lot of facts, and believe me, there's lots more out there. I learned from this past week. On the facts, I feel like I have raised my competency level, so that I was unconsciously incompetent. Now I am consciously barely competent because I have looked at this stuff. On an experience level, I realize, though, I am still consciously incompetent. I have no idea what it's like to walk in the shoes of these desperate people. No idea what that's like. You know, I was thinking about the issues that we're talking about in the series, and last week was right to die. And in past years, I did abortion. And there are those topics that I do not believe that facts help us. I think it's going to come down to your convictions and your values, and no amount of facts ever kind of sway you one way or the other. And when I started looking at immigration, I thought it might be one of those issues. But after spending a week looking at it, I don't think that anymore. This is a topic where facts help. Where facts ought to impact the way we approach and think about this issue. You know, you look back and you realize that the Egyptians enslaved the Israelites out of fear. The Jewish people hated Samaritans because of their impurity. lots of people buy into stereotypes, and that is much of what goes on today. But there have always been foreigners, strangers, aliens, vulnerable people who had to rely on their host. And that takes us back to Leviticus. One of the things that's amazing about the Bible, you can read chapter after chapter, especially in the Old Testament, especially in Leviticus, and you can find laws and rules that reflect human behavior at its most petty, at its worst, where the laws that they spout are just meant to support the worst things about people. I mean, in Leviticus, you can find laws about how to treat a person as property. Silly laws about not wearing clothing of two different materials. Laws about how to punish a man who sleeps with a man as if with a woman. None of those surprise me when I read the passage. I mean, that was an old culture. I'm not surprised by those laws. I'm shocked by this one. Because the people in those days were just as suspicious of foreigners as people are today. They were just as afraid of strangers as people are today. It amazes me that this passage shows up in the Old Testament. And what it tells me is that perhaps this is the divine Word of God shining through a very flawed document. Because this made people uncomfortable back then just as much as it makes people uncomfortable today. And whenever something makes me uncomfortable, I listen closely, because it might just be the divine. This has been a very interesting week for me. I hope to learn a lot more about other topics too. The discussion class that Dave does is a wonderful companion piece to this. I know he talks about some of the myths of immigration, used the Chamber of Commerce document, I believe. So give this some more thought, do some more research. Try not to get into fear-mongering, try not to get into racial stereotyping, and just investigate for yourself. But just remember, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Love your neighbor as yourself.